The creek ran low that summer, and Daniel Whitcomb could hear it from his porch every night, a sound like something whispering just out of reach. He had lived alone on the north side of that water for 6 years, and for 4 of those years he had watched smoke rise from the chimney across the way, and told himself it was none of his business whose fire it was. But the truth was simpler than that, and harder to admit. He was afraid of the widow across the creek. Not afraid the way a man fears a rattler in the grass. Afraid the way a man fears a door he has never opened, because he does not know what is behind it and has built a comfortable life around not finding out. Her name was Leanne Zhao, though most of Cedar Hollow, Wyoming only ever called her the Chinese widow, and said it the way they might describe weather, a fact of the landscape rather than a woman with a history. She had come to the territory in 1868 with her husband, a laborer who had worked the grading crews for the Union Pacific before a rock slide near Green River took his life and left her a small parcel of land nobody in town wanted to buy from her and nobody in town wanted to see her keep. She had kept it anyway. 6 years now. The farmhouse across the creek from Daniel's ranch was old and gray-boarded, the kind of structure that looked like it might list sideways in a strong wind, but it never had. Leanne Zhao mended the roof herself. She dug her own well. She grew vegetables in neat, obsessive rows that put every other garden in the county to shame, and she sold them at the edge of town on Saturdays from a wagon she had built with her own hands, because no shopkeeper in Cedar Hollow would let her set up a stall inside. Daniel knew all of this because he watched her, the way a man watches a fire burning on a distant ridge, close enough to see, too far to feel the heat. It was the 3rd week of July, 1874, when the fence between their 2 properties came down. Not the fence itself, the line. Old Silas Bennett, who ran 200 head of cattle on the spread east of both their properties, had decided that the widow's land, unclaimed by any bank and undefended by any husband, was land he intended to run his herd across whether she liked it or not. He had tried it twice already that summer, small tests, a dozen head grazing on her south field for an afternoon before she chased them off with a broom, and a voice that carried louder than her small frame suggested it could. But on that 3rd week of July, Bennett did not send a dozen head. He sent 60. Daniel heard the commotion before he saw it, the low, complaining bawl of cattle and the crack of a whip, and, underneath all of it, a voice raised in a language he did not understand but recognized instantly as fury. He set down the harness he had been mending and walked to the edge of his property, and what he saw across the creek stopped him cold. Leanne Zhao stood in the middle of her own vegetable field, arms spread wide as though she could hold back 60 head of cattle with her body alone, while 3 of Bennett's hired men sat their horses at the fence line and laughed. Daniel had told himself for 6 years that the creek was a boundary he had no right to cross. He had told himself that a woman living alone, working alone, surviving alone, had built that solitude on purpose and would not thank a stranger for wading in uninvited. But watching her stand her ground against 60 head of cattle and 3 armed men, something in his chest went hot and simple, and every reason he had constructed for staying on his own side of the water fell apart at once. He was in the creek before he had decided to move. The water came up to his knees, cold even in July, and by the time he reached the far bank his boots were soaked through, and he did not care. One of Bennett's men, a broad-shouldered rider named Cyrus Doyle, turned his horse toward Daniel with an expression that suggested he found the whole scene entertaining. "This ain't your land, Whitcomb," Doyle said. "Best you turn around and dry your feet." "It ain't your land either," Daniel said. "Bennett's cattle got no business here, and you know it." "Bennett says different." Bennett can say what he wants from his own porch. Daniel's voice was steady, though his heart was not. Turn this herd around, or I'll be riding into town this afternoon to speak with the marshal about trespass and intent to defraud a land claim. It was a bluff built on thin legal ground, and Daniel knew it. But he said it with enough conviction that Doyle's smile faltered, and after a long moment of calculation, the rider spat into the dust and gave a short whistle to turn the herd. The cattle moved off, trampled rows of beans and squash left behind in their wake, and Bennett's men rode away without another word, though the look Doyle threw back over his shoulder promised this was not finished. Daniel stood in the ruined garden, water still dripping from his trouser legs, and turned to find Leon Jow watching him with an expression he could not read. She did not thank him. She looked instead at the destruction around her feet, and her jaw tightened in a way that told Daniel she was doing sums in her head, counting the loss in a season's worth of labor. "I did not ask for help," she said. Her English was careful and precise, shaped by years of practice rather than any accent of uncertainty. "You should not have crossed the creek." "Wasn't going to stand on my own side and watch that." "You do not know me." She said it plainly, not unkindly, but with a wall behind it that Daniel understood immediately. "You have lived across that water for 6 years. You have never crossed it before today." He had no answer for that, because it was true, and there was no way to explain the truth without admitting a kind of cowardice he was not proud of. "No," he said finally, "I haven't. That was wrong of me. Ought to have been a neighbor to you long before now." Something shifted in her face, not quite forgiveness, but not quite dismissal either. She looked down at the trampled rows of vegetables, and for the first time Daniel saw the cost written plainly in her posture, the exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting this same fight alone for 6 years and had just watched a season of food go under 60 pairs of hooves. "Bennett will come back," she said. "He does not stop because he loses once." "No," Daniel agreed. "He won't." "Then you have made yourself his enemy for nothing." "Wasn't for nothing." Daniel looked at the garden, then at her. "What's your name, ma'am? Proper introduction feels overdue." She studied him a long moment before answering, as though weighing whether the question deserved a real response. "Leon Jow." "Daniel Whitcomb." He touched the brim of his hat, an old habit that felt suddenly formal given the circumstances, standing ankle deep in ruined squash vines with creek water still in his boots. "I'll send some men over tomorrow to help you replant what's salvageable." "I do not need charity." "Wasn't offering charity, offering neighborliness. There's a difference, and I expect you know it better than most, seeing as you've been extending it to this whole county for 6 years without anybody extending it back." That landed somewhere true. He watched it land. She did not soften exactly, but something in her shoulders eased a fraction, the particular relief of being seen accurately after a long time of being looked past. "I will consider your offer," she said, which was, Daniel would come to learn, about as close to acceptance as Leon Jow allowed herself with a stranger. He crossed back over the creek that evening with wet boots and a strange lightness in his chest that he did not examine too closely, and he did not yet know that the deed to her land, filed 6 years earlier under her late husband's name and never properly transferred, was the exact weakness Silas Bennett intended to exploit. The next morning, Daniel showed up at the creek's edge with 2 ranch hands, a wagon of seed, and a jaw set against the possibility of being turned away. Leanne Zhao met him at the bank of the creek, arms crossed, and looked at the wagon for a long moment before stepping back to let him cross. They worked through the morning in near silence, replanting rows that Bennett's cattle had destroyed, and Daniel noticed things he had never had cause to notice before. The precision of her garden rows, straight as a rifle sight. The way she tested the soil in her palm before deciding what to plant where. The calluses on her hands, earned the same way his own had been earned, through years of labor that left no room for softness. By midday, one of Daniel's men, a young hire named Otis Freeman, made the mistake of asking Leanne Zhao where she had learned to farm like that. "My husband," she said, not looking up from the row she was working, "and before him, my father, outside Canton." "Didn't figure Chinese folk for farmers," Otis said, not with malice, just the careless honesty of a young man who had never thought much before. Leanne Zhao's hands stilled on the soil. "My family farmed rice for 4 generations before the flood that took our land," she said. "We understand growing things better than most men in this territory understand anything at all." Otis had the decency to look ashamed, and Daniel, watching from a few rows over, felt something in him that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but close to both. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that she had come to this land with nothing and built something small and fragile out of desperation. He had not considered that she might have arrived already knowing more about the soil than any man in Cedar Hollow. That afternoon, working the rows beside her, Daniel asked the question he had wondered about for 6 years and never had the standing to ask. "Why'd you stay? After your husband passed. Nobody would have blamed you for moving on to San Francisco, somewhere with more of your own people." Leanne Zhao was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. "This land is the only thing in this country that is mine," she said finally. "Not my husband's name on a deed, not a room in someone else's house. Mine. I dug that well myself. I built that fence myself. If I leave with nothing, the same as I arrived. If I stay, I have this." She gestured at the rows of green pushing up from dark soil. "It is not much to some. It is everything to me." Daniel understood that in a way he had not expected to. He had built his own ranch out of nothing after his father died, owing more than the land was worth, and he knew the particular stubbornness required to hold ground that everyone around you believed you should abandon. "Bennett's going to keep coming," he said. "Man like that don't stop at one lost herd." "I know." "What's your plan when he does?" She looked at him, and for the first time there was something almost like humor in her expression, dry and quick. "The same plan I have had for 6 years. I do not leave." He believed her. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel found reasons to cross the creek that had nothing to do with cattle or fences. He came to mend a section of her roof that had loosened in a storm, though she had already been repairing it herself before he arrived, and made clear she had it well in hand. He came to bring a spare horse when hers went lame, and stayed to help her walk the animal through the worst of the swelling. He came eventually, without any excuse at all, and sat on the porch step while she shelled beans into a wooden bowl, and they talked about small things, weather, the price of grain, the particular meanness of Wyoming winters. She told him, slowly, in pieces offered only when she chose to offer them, about the crossing from Canton, about the husband she had married for practicality and grown to love through years of shared labor, about the rock slide that had taken him and left her with a deed that half the county considered invalid simply because her name sat beneath his on the paper rather than above it. He told her about his own losses, a father dead of drink and debt, a brother who had gone west to the gold fields and never written again. 6 years of solitary work that had built a solid ranch and an empty house. "You never married," she said one evening, not quite a question. "Never had cause to, or never let myself have cause to. Hard to say which." Daniel turned his hat over in his hands. "Man gets used to quiet, starts to think quiet is the same as peace. Took me a long while to understand those aren't the same thing at all." Lian Jiao did not respond to that directly, but she set down her bowl of beans and looked at him with an attention that felt like its own kind of answer. But the quiet between them, fragile and new, was not given long to settle. On the first Saturday of August, Lian Jiao rode into Cedar Hollow with her wagon of vegetables as she did every week, and found the space where she always set up her stall occupied by a hastily constructed sign nailed to a post. By order of the town council, no peddling without license. She had sold vegetables from that same spot for 6 years without a license, because no one had ever required one from her. The timing was not subtle. Silas Bennett sat on the town council, and everyone in Cedar Hollow, including Lian Jiao, understood exactly whose hand had put that sign in the ground. She did not cry. She did not argue with the deputy who stood near the sign with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression caught between apology and duty. She simply turned her wagon around and drove back toward the creek, and it was not until she was alone on the road, out of sight of the town, that the weight of it finally caught up with her, and she had to stop the wagon and sit for a long moment with her face in her hands. When Daniel heard what had happened from Otis, who had been in town buying nails, he did not hesitate. He rode straight to the county land office before it closed and spent an hour going through records with a clerk who clearly wished he had asked for anything else. What he found confirmed what he had feared. The original deed to Lian Jiao's land had been filed under her husband's name alone in 1868, and though territorial law technically allowed a widow to inherit her husband's claim, the process required a formal transfer that had never been completed, an oversight born of a grieving woman with no one to guide her through unfamiliar paperwork and a clerk's office that had never bothered to explain the requirement to a Chinese widow they assumed would simply move on. Bennett knew this. Bennett had likely known it for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Daniel rode to her farmhouse that evening with the information sitting like a stone in his chest, because he understood now that this was not merely about a peddling license or a trampled garden. This was about the land itself, and whether Lian Jiao would be allowed to keep it at all. He found her sitting on her porch step in the last light of evening, and when she saw his face, she did not ask what was wrong. She simply moved over to make room for him to sit. "Bennett means to take the land," she said before he could speak. "I have suspected this for some time." "The deed was never transferred proper after your husband passed," Daniel said quietly. "A man like Bennett could file a claim of abandonment or dispute, and unless somebody stands up in that land office and argues different, a territorial judge might rule the whole parcel unclaimed." Lian Jiao was silent for a long moment, looking out at the fields she had built with her own hands, the rows of vegetables catching the last orange light of day. 6 years, she said finally. 6 years of proving I could hold this land, and it comes down to a piece of paper I did not know I needed. "We'll fix the paper." "We." She turned to look at him, and there was something raw in her voice now, the wall she kept around herself cracking just slightly. "Why do you care so much what happens to me, Daniel Whitcomb? You crossed that creek once, out of some sudden conscience, and now you cross it every week like it costs you nothing. What is it you want from me?" The question hung in the evening air between them, and Daniel understood it was not an accusation, but a genuine wound. The wound of a woman who had learned that kindness in this territory usually came with a price attached, and she was bracing herself to hear what his price might be. "I don't want anything from you," he said slowly, "except to keep crossing that creek for the rest of my life, if you'll let me." Lian Zhao went very still. I spent 6 years telling myself the water between our properties was a line I had no business crossing, Daniel continued. Told myself I was respecting your independence. Truth is, I was scared. Scared of wanting something I didn't think I had any right to want. But I've watched you fight for this land with a strength most men in this county couldn't match. And somewhere in these past 2 weeks, I stopped seeing a widow across the creek and started seeing a woman I didn't want to spend another 6 years too afraid to know. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Daniel wondered if he had said too much, moved too fast, mistaken careful friendship for something it was not. Then she reached over, slowly, and placed her hand over his on the porch step, her calloused palm rough against his own. I have been afraid too, she said quietly. Afraid that wanting anything in this country would only give someone else a way to hurt me. It is easier to want nothing. Nothing can be taken from you. I don't aim to take anything from you, Leanne. Only to stand beside you, if you'll allow it. She did not answer in words. She simply tightened her hand around his, and they sat together on the porch step as the light faded completely, the creek murmuring behind them in the dark, and for the first time in 6 years, neither of them felt the water as a boundary at all. But the tenderness of that evening did not undo the danger waiting in Cedar Hollow, and both of them knew it. The following week, Bennett moved openly. He filed a formal dispute at the land office, claiming the parcel across the creek had been abandoned by proper legal heir, and was therefore available for territorial claim, citing the incomplete transfer as evidence that no valid owner existed. A hearing was set before the circuit judge, due to arrive in Cedar Hollow in 10 days' time, and the entire town understood what everyone was too polite to say aloud. A Chinese widow with no husband, no sons, and no standing in the community stood little chance against a councilman with money, connections, and 60 head of cattle to spare. Daniel spent those 10 days doing everything within his power. He rode to Green River to find the surviving crew foreman who had employed Lian Zhao's husband, a weathered man named Elijah Cross, who remembered her husband well and was willing to swear a statement confirming the marriage and the labor that had earned the original claim. He tracked down the minister who had performed their wedding ceremony 6 years earlier, still serving a small congregation 2 counties over, and secured a written record of the union. He spent an entire day going through the county archive with the reluctant clerk, cross-referencing tax payments that Lian Zhao had made faithfully every single year on land Bennett now claimed she had abandoned. Lian Zhao, for her part, refused to sit quietly and wait for others to decide her fate. She wrote her own account of the 6 years since her husband's death, detailed and precise. Every crop planted, every improvement made, every hardship endured and overcome. And she brought it to Daniel, not for his approval, but because she wanted a second pair of eyes to check her English for anything a judge might misread. You did not need to do this alone, Daniel said, reading through pages of careful, deliberate handwriting. I did not do it alone, she said, but I did it myself. There is a difference, and I think you understand it. He did. 2 nights before the hearing, Cyrus Doyle and 2 other Bennett riders came to the creek under cover of darkness, and Daniel, who had taken to sleeping in his barn within sight of the water since the trouble started, heard the horses before he saw the fire. They had set the corner of Lian Zhao's barn alight, a warning meant to frighten rather than destroy. But fire in a dry Wyoming summer did not always respect the intentions of the men who set it. Daniel was across the creek before the flames had spread past the first support beam, shouting for Lian Zhao, who emerged from the farmhouse already moving toward the well with a bucket in each hand, her face set with the same grim determination he had seen the first day he crossed the water. They fought the fire together. Buckets passed hand to hand between them in a rhythm that required no words, and by the time Otis and 2 other ranch hands arrived from Daniel's property, drawn by the glow against the night sky. The worst of the flames had already been beaten back. The barn was scorched but standing. No animals had been lost. But the message had been delivered clearly enough. And standing in the wreckage of smoke and steam, Daniel felt something in him go cold and resolved in a way it had never been before. "This ends after the hearing," he said. "One way or another, it ends." Leanne Zhao, soot streaked across her face, looked at the barn, then at him. "You did not have to come." "I'll come every time," Daniel said. "Every single time, for as long as you'll have me." She did not answer with words that night either. She simply took his hand, blackened with ash, and held it while the smoke cleared and the creek ran on behind them in the dark, indifferent to everything except its own steady course. The hearing was held in the Cedar Hollow Meeting Hall on a Thursday morning in late August, and it seemed as though half the county had turned out to watch, drawn by the particular hunger small towns have for witnessing a fight they have gossiped about for weeks. Judge Harmon Pruitt, a circuit judge known for a dry manner and little patience for theatrics, sat behind a borrowed desk at the front of the hall and listened first to Bennett's attorney lay out the claim of abandonment, the incomplete transfer, the technical argument that the land had reverted to unclaimed status the moment Leanne Zhao's husband died without a properly filed heir designation. It was, Daniel had to admit, a case built on solid legal ground. Bennett had not lied about the paperwork. He had simply exploited a gap that a grieving widow, unfamiliar with territorial law and unaided by anyone who should have helped her, had never known to close. But when it came time for Leanne Zhao to speak, she did not plead. She stood, straight-backed, and laid before the judge 6 years of tax receipts, 6 years of improvements documented in her own careful hand, a sworn statement from the crew foreman who had employed her husband, and a record of marriage from a minister still living 2 counties over. "I've paid taxes on this land every year since my husband died," she said, her voice steady, though the room was full of eyes she knew were not friendly. "I have improved this land every year since my husband died. I have fed this county from that land every Saturday for 6 years, until Councilman Bennett decided a license I never needed before was suddenly required. The same week his cattle destroyed half my crop. I did not abandon this land. I have never once left it, not for a single day." Bennett's attorney tried to argue the legal technicality still stood regardless of her diligence, but Judge Pruitt, who had sat through enough territorial disputes to recognize the smell of a manufactured case, cut him off with a single dry question. "Councilman Bennett's cattle destroyed her crop the same week he began his legal claim of abandonment," the judge said, looking over his spectacles at Bennett, who sat in the front row with an expression that had gone carefully blank. "Seems a peculiar coincidence, wouldn't you say?" The hall went very quiet. Daniel stood then, though it was not his place in the formal proceeding, and asked permission to speak. When the judge granted it, he laid out plainly what had happened over the past month. The cattle sent onto her land, the peddling license invented specifically to cut off her income, the fire set 2 nights before the hearing by men who worked for Bennett and had been seen leaving the property by 3 witnesses, including himself. "This isn't a woman who abandoned her claim, Your Honor," Daniel said. "This is a woman who has been fighting off a man determined to take what's hers because he believed nobody would stand up for her. I'm standing up for her. And I expect, given the chance, half this town would too, if they weren't so afraid of crossing a councilman." A murmur ran through the hall, and Daniel saw more than a few faces shift, the particular discomfort of people realizing they had let silence do a bully's work for him. Judge Pruitt took only a few minutes to render his decision. The deed transfer, he ruled, would be completed immediately in Leanne Zhao's name, retroactive to the date of her husband's death, closing the paperwork gap that should have been closed 6 years earlier. He further noted, with the dry precision of a man who had seen every trick in the territorial law book, that any further disputes filed by Councilman Bennett against this parcel would be examined with considerable skepticism, given the pattern of harassment documented before this court. Bennett left the hall without a word to anyone, and though he remained on the town council for some months after, his influence in Cedar Hollow had been quietly and permanently diminished, the kind of loss that follows a man who has been publicly shown to be small. 3 months passed, and the last of the summer heat gave way to the sharper air of a Wyoming autumn. The farmhouse across the creek had a new roof by then, replaced beam by beam through the cooling weeks of September, and the scorched corner of the barn had been rebuilt entirely, sturdier than before. Leanne Zhao's garden, recovered fully from Bennett's cattle, produced a harvest so abundant she began selling preserved vegetables through the winter months as well as fresh produce in summer, and the peddling license, once used as a weapon against her, now hung framed on the wall of her farmhouse, properly filed and entirely legitimate, a small trophy of the fight she had won. She no longer set up her wagon at the edge of town. A shopkeeper named Walter Meade, ashamed of the town's silence during the hearing, had offered her a stall inside his general store instead, and business had been steady ever since. Customers who had once looked past her now stopping deliberately to buy from the woman who had stood down a councilman in open court. Daniel had built a bridge across the creek that autumn. Sturdy planks laid over stone footings, wide enough for a wagon to cross without wetting a single wheel. He had built it without asking her permission first, and when she found it finished one October morning, she stood at the edge of it for a long while before crossing over to where he waited on the other side. "You did not need to build this," she said, though her voice carried none of the guardedness it once had. "I have crossed that water on foot for 6 years." "I know it." Daniel took her hand as she stepped onto the bank. "Figured it was time the crossing got easier for both of us." They were married in November, in a small ceremony at the Cedar Hollow Chapel that surprised absolutely no one in the county, given how many Saturdays that summer and autumn Daniel Whitcomb had been seen crossing the creek with no cattle business to justify the trip. Elijah Cross rode 2 days to attend, standing as witness alongside Otis Freeman and Walter Meade, and even a handful of townsfolk who had once called her only the Chinese widow came to watch, drawn by something that felt, in the end, like genuine respect finally paid where it was long overdue. Leanne Zhao wore no elaborate dress, only her best blue coat against the November chill, and when the minister pronounced them married, Daniel thought of the first evening he had crossed that water in fear and uncertainty, and how far a man could travel in a single season if he only found the courage to take the first step. They built their life together on both sides of the creek that following spring, running Daniel's cattle and Leanne Zhao's garden as a single working ranch, and though the two properties remained legally distinct on paper, filed and recorded and beyond any councilman's reach forever, in practice there was no longer any line between them at all, just water running quiet beneath a bridge that a man had built with his own hands, because he had finally understood that love, real love, does not wait to be asked before it crosses over. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.